Good evening. My name is Grace Hayek, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to our program tonight on The Mummy as Monster. Thank you to the Friends of the Library for sponsoring this program and for so many other programs that their support allows us to present. This program is being recorded and will be put on the library's YouTube channel in a day or two. Our presenter tonight is Dr. Foy Scalf, Head of Research Archives at the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at the University of Chicago, formerly known as the Oriental Institute. Dr. Scalf studied Egyptology at the University of Chicago and has published on many topics, including Egyptian grammar, philology, demotic texts, magic, and religion. He also leads the Oriental Institute's integrated database project. He teaches classes for the Institute's Museum Education Program, department, and also lectures in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago and at the School of Information Studies at Dominican University. He's given several programs for the library, including in February 2023, he delivered a very interesting one on hieroglyphics, and in June of this year, he presented a program on revival architecture and its ancient derivatives. Both of these are available on the library's YouTube channel. You're again most welcome, Dr. Scalf, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. So, as you might be able to see from the screen, what we want to talk about tonight is the background to the character that we all know as the Mummy. And what we really want to look at here is how this character was influenced through both sort of, let's say, two primary factors. On the one hand, ancient Egyptian culture and ancient Egyptian antiquities, but then also on the other hand, the Victorian Gothic and the approach to those antiquities that was common in the 19th and early 20th century. And of course, this is the sort of image a lot of us think of, especially around this time during Halloween, when we think of the mummy as sort of, right, reanimated body coming out of its wrappings, coming to, in most of the mummy movies at least, right, strangle you or attempt to murder you. And in this particular scene, which we'll come back to later from some pulp comics, I just particularly like this one where we have the mummy coming out, right, arg, and then the damsel in distress yelling, "Get back, don't touch me." And then the part that I really like here, "Good Lord, these spells have to work, they must, or else nothing can stop this monster, nothing." And he's reading from a magic book, which has also become a trope of the mummy movies and some of the mummy stories that we want to look into the background of this particular trope. So in the discussion tonight, the way I want to break this up is first talk about the mummy right? This mummy character that we know from, let's say, most particularly film. But what we'll learn today is that there's a long literary history behind that film character. Look at the ancient conceptions of how ancient Egyptians actually viewed their mummified human remains of their ancestors and what they thought and how that might clash or overlap with our modern conceptualizations of this character known as the mummy, how some of those ancient Egyptian images and themes and cultural objects were appropriated, again, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. Look at those early mummy tales that influenced, for example, especially the films, but then also much of the mummy literature that we know, like some of these that you see here coming out of like pulp fiction and pulp comics, especially in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. These were very popular. They continue to be. And of course, in fact, go to the grocery store right now and you're going to see mummies all over everything. Go into the candy aisle right now, there's mummies everywhere, ancient Egyptian sort of themes leaving on. And then we'll wrap up with some conclusions about some of those influences into this character that we know. Now, there's a couple of important points that I want to raise at the beginning of this, just before we get into it. And that's number one, in a section of this discussion, I will show some images of mummified human remains. Most of this, again, is to illustrate the approach to those remains that you find in the 19th and 20th centuries, because it's an important influence for this genre and for this character. The other thing I want to talk about is when I say the mummy, I'm really referring to the character from this media, right? These stories, the film, and other media that we have about it. So that's referring to the character. And what I'm going to try to do is avoid as much as possible, although there are some exceptions, using the word mummy or mummies as just a general term to refer to mummified human remains. One of the reasons that we're trying to avoid that now is because of how it objectifies those human remains and sort of turns them into objects. And you'll see actually when we look at some of the earliest quote unquote Egyptological type of publications, that they're treating those human remains as objects. I mean, they're literally called, right, antiquities, right? They're not being thought of as actual human remains. So we're trying to reverse that in our discipline nowadays and think about these people as ancient people who have mummified human remains. And so when I use the term mummy in a few cases in this talk, most of the time I'm trying to put it in its historical context of how the 19th and 20th century, let's say, people who are visiting Egypt and bringing antiquities back, or others were approaching this. And in that context is where we'll see some of this, because I think it's important to illuminate how the character of the mummy becomes a monster, because of course in ancient Egypt, the mummy didn't exist as a character, right? But when we think about mummified human remains, they had a very different conceptualization of that, one that was not monstrous in any of the way that we think of this Victorian horror Gothic genre. Okay, so we will be looking at some of that as we go. So the first thing we want to look at then is this character that we know as the mummy, largely, but not only, coming out of especially the 1932 The Mummy film, which really launched a whole series, a whole genre of films and then spin-offs into other stories, but we'll look at the background of that. And of course, in that film, we have this scene where the unwitting archaeological assistant reads from a scroll, and those magic spells reanimate the mummy, of course, played by Boris Karloff, and named Imhotep, which we'll come back to that. And of course, that story got sort of the reboot in the 1990s, which many of the younger generation probably know the mummy from the Brendan Fraser films in that reboot. But what you see already in both of those films, and sort of really being, let's say, launched again, not only in, but for most of the main public knowledge coming out of that 1932 film, is this idea of reading from a scroll and either activating or deactivating the power of these figures. And I also love this example on the left, this Web of Mystery cover, where here the mummy has come back and now imprisoned the professor who discovered the mummy. So notice here, for centuries I have waited for someone to find my tomb. Now you shall take my place, professor, while I've got plans, great plans. And one reason I really love that cover on the left is it actually hung in my professor's office, Robert Rittner, who passed away a couple years ago, and it hung there in his office for all the years that I knew him. So he's sort of always loved this sort of what we might call Egyptomania material. So these tropes about reanimated bodies and using magical spells to reanimate or deactivate them, they actually do have some background from ancient Egyptian stories. And so they're sort of pulling bits and pieces out. Just to give you a couple of examples, that in the beginning of the 1932 Mummy film, we see this, what they call the Scroll of Thoth, right? Here are set down the magic words by which Isis raised Osiris from the dead. So they're pulling out of real Egyptian mythology, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail here in a minute, the mythology of Osiris, and pulling this into the movie. Now, a couple things about this, the Scroll of Thoth that they use here, there are ancient Egyptian texts that are referred to in this way. And in fact, the facsimile that was used at the beginning of the movie is derived from an actual real papyrus that today is in the British Museum. It belonged to an ancient Egyptian man named Hu-Nefer. You see it here on the right. This is what we would call today a Book of the Dead papyrus. But these Book of the Dead papyri could be called in ancient Egyptian scrolls of Thoth. So you see here on the right side and in the center a hieroglyphic spell, and on the right side this set of hieroglyphs that refers to the Mejot Net Jehuti, or the book, literally the scroll, the papyrus scroll of Thoth. And so this is a real designation coming out of ancient Egyptian material that was sort of being borrowed into that mummy movie, but being borrowed from a very specific source, not just these, let's say, what to us is pretty widely known, these Book of the Dead papyri, these sort of larger scale generic religious texts in ancient Egypt. But there's actually a story that parallels some of the events that were recreated in the 1932 film from ancient Egypt, where we have a character who goes back to a tomb to steal a scroll of Thoth and use it for its magic power. So the elements that you see in the film referring to the scroll of Thoth actually has this background in a tale that we call the Tale of Setna I. Setna was the main character. Historically, that name goes back to a son of Ramses II. But in later periods, this papyrus is from what we call the Ptolemaic period. So let's say the 2nd century BC, roughly. And it tells this story about Setna, who's going around looking for ancient scrolls. And then when he reads them, he can actually enchant, that is, use a magical spell to see things that other people can't see. So here's a little excerpt from the text. If you want to read a text, come to me so that I can have you taken to the place where the book is, of which Thoth was the one who wrote it with his own hand himself. So you can see here the scroll of Thoth. Thoth is the author. When he had come down after the gods, 2 written formulae are on its surface. If you, that should be, repeat the first formula, you will encompass the sky, earth, and the netherworld. And so this particular tale coming out of the Ptolemaic period actually served as one of the influences for these later mummy stories, and in particular, the film from 1932. These are some early illustrations you see of Setna, this character from this ancient Egyptian story, that were added to an English translation of this story that appeared. I believe these were in the late 19th century when these illustrations were done. And so it's the source, this story is the source of the Scroll of Thoth, central to the 1932 film. Boris Karloff's transformation into an aged Egyptian who leads excavators to the hidden tomb of his ancient love is borrowed directly from the final page of this ancient story that was written in a script that we call Demotic, a script and phase of the ancient Egyptian language. And you see a page from that here on the left side of the screen. So on the one hand, you have these scrolls that are a major sort of trope that you find in the mummy film and these mummy stories. So scrolls, again, either to reanimate the mummy or to deactivate the mummy if you know the right spell. But then the other part that you have in these films, the other major trope is the mummy's curse, right? That we all know very well. And so again, from the 1932 film, death, eternal punishment for anyone who opens this casket in the name of Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. Good heavens, what a terrible curse, right? And so it's these curses that animate the plot, animate the crux of the story. As we saw earlier, that unwitting archaeological assistant reads from the scroll, accidentally brings Imhotep back to life, and sort of launches all the rest of the plot in the film. Now, there actually is a background to this. And when you see this, I should say, when you see this spread to other films, this curse aspect, these are some of the other as it's picked up in other films like Charlie Chan in Egypt. And it's actually kind of interesting. This is an aside. I won't spend much time on this. But if you look up some of these hieroglyphic texts that they added to these films, it's clear you can sort of pick out how they got the words. They opened up one of the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionaries that were published at that time. So again, roughly 100 years ago now, and sort of just piecemeal the words together based on the English translation. So it's not actually good Egyptian hieroglyphs here, but you can make sense out of it based on what an English speaker would think trying to pull the hieroglyphic words out. So this curse then becomes a trope in these films, all the way down to, again, today, where you can buy toys for the mummy's curse, or if you so dare, you can sleep under a bed sheet that says death shall come on swift wings. So if you really want to test fate, you can go all the way down the curse rabbit hole, you might say. But, and of course, everything has been blamed on these mummy curses, like the sinking of the Titanic, even in rag newspapers like this. But if we go back to ancient Egypt, we actually do find real tomb curses. You know, the most famous story comes out of the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922, and lots of people have heard stories about that, and perhaps Lord Carnarvon had been, sort of killed by the mummy's curse, and even though he's died from an infection. But if we go back, and I should say there weren't really curse-specific texts in the tomb of King Tut, but there are curses, quote unquote, let's put scare quotes around that we know from ancient tombs, and mostly what they say are things like this. for somebody who comes to harm this tomb, here are bad things that are going to happen to you. So it is sort of a rough idea that you get borrowed into these movies. So the one on the right, you see, for example, this is from the tomb of a guy named Minnie, and he says, if you're going to do anything bad here, a crocodile be against you in the water, a snake against you on land, right? So he's sort of putting the heebie-jeebies, right? The evil animals, the noxious, dangerous creatures after you if you're going to harm their tomb. And we have also examples where a very famous tomb curse is, if you do any harm to this tomb, like I'll wring your neck like a bird. So we have these texts from ancient Egypt that are loosely, inspiring some of this material in the mummy movies, but only loosely. None of them, I want to be very specific, none of these ancient Egyptian curses assume that the tomb owner's mummified remains are going to get up and do anything about it. All right, so the difference with the mummy trope that you see in the films, and going back to some earlier stories that I'll tell you about, it's always there that it's the mummy, right? The mummified human remains of someone getting up to do awful stuff. But in ancient Egypt, that was absolutely not the case. The quote unquote curses were always basically just general bad things will happen to you if you harm anything in this tomb or the tomb itself. And most of those threats are the natural threats that you might find in ancient Egypt, like crocodiles, snakes, drowning, etc. We also, though, have mention of using magic spells for the purpose of harming other people, like you have in these movies and these stories. And I just wanted to point maybe the most famous one out. This is from a trial after one of the pharaohs of Egypt were murdered. And in the trial, they talk about when they captured the people who were behind the assassination attempt, this is what they say they were doing. This refers to the person one of the people who were plotting against the pharaoh, he began to make writings of magic for exorcising and for disturbing, and he began to make gods of wax and potions for laming people's limbs. They were placed in the hand of Pabak Kamen, whom Pre did not allow to be chamberlain, and the other great enemies, saying, let them approach. So what they're doing here is planning with their black magic and quote unquote, let's call them voodoo dolls, right? Your gods of wax, your potions, which you're aiming against the king. And what you'll see if you read down to the end is that once he realized he was caught and found guilty, that this person, according to these legal texts, then committed suicide. So this was part of the assassination of a king named Ramses III. Here you see his remains, which have been studied, and the conclusion was that actually he had his throat slit. So the assassination attempt appears to have been successful. But the plotter was said to be his son, somebody named Pentaweret, and many, many people have connected Pentaweret, this son of Ramses III, as the plotter to overthrow the king, with this particular set of mummified human remains, which is often referred to as Unknown Man E. And this, already discovered in 1881, these kinds of images and this kind of part of the story influenced things like these mummy films. So not only do you have the Scroll of Thoth, this very loose basing of some of the plot characteristics after this tale of Setna that we mentioned just a minute ago, you also have part of these plots based on some actual events from New Kingdom Egypt. So New Kingdom Egypt is the period between, let's say, 1550 BC and about 1000 BC. And here's from an article by one of my colleagues, Stuart Smith, where he says, in The Mummy, in the film, Imhotep uses magic to attack, paralyze, and bend people to his will. These actions and Imhotep's fate share some similarities with real events in New Kingdom Egypt. So part one, using magic to attack, paralyze, and bend people to his will, that's what we saw mentioned in that papyrus I just showed you, right? Those people who were planning against the pharaoh were using quote unquote black magic. If you want to talk about that at the end in the Q&A, we can. But then on the other hand, people have connected that set of mummified remains of Unknown Man E as someone who was buried potentially alive. And so notice here Stuart's quote, at least one of the conspirators, probably Ramses III's son Pentawera, may have been buried alive in an unmarked coffin. This archaeological discovery clearly influenced Balderston's screenplay and had a major impact on the mummy genre. So if we just go back very briefly to look here, there's many odd aspects about this particular mummification, but also people have referred to just the sort of the grimace on the face of this individual as suggestive of how they may have died. And most people nowadays actually think that that's inaccurate, because obviously your mouth will fall open when your muscles are no longer working. So the pose may not have anything to do with how that person died. But this was a major talking point when those were found, when those mummified human remains were found, and also then inspired some of these stories. So you have this influence coming right out of ancient Egyptian stories and archaeological discoveries that helped influence these stories. But what were the ancient Egyptians' actual beliefs about these mummified human remains, what we call mummies, and how they worked? As I mentioned to you, I mean, just to sort of take away the surprise, the ancient Egyptians, when you read their text, it's pretty clear. There are sort of symbolism and allusions, but for the most part, it's clear that the human body they did not think was going to reanimate, right? The ancient Egyptians knew better. They were keen observers of the world around them. They knew when they mummified their ancestors and put them in their tombs, they didn't see them up walking around anymore. So the way that Egyptian mummification worked is it was mimicking a mythological story that they had about this god, the god named Osiris. And Osiris in the mythology was killed in a battle for control of ancient Egypt at the beginning of time with his brother Seth. And Seth kills Osiris, dismembers him, and throws his body parts into the river and scatters them across Egypt. And it's up to Osiris's family, so his son Horus, his wife and sister Isis, and sister Nephthys, to bring back his body parts together, put them back together. I'll just show you very quickly. We'll skip ahead one or two slides here. Here's a papyrus showing the body parts of Osiris, right, all scattered about, and then they need to be brought back together. Here you see Anubis doing the actual embalming, bringing the body parts together. How do you put them back together? You wrap them in linen, right? You sort of use an artificial method to bring these body parts back together, and it's through the recitations of his sister Isis, so the magic words that she speaks, that let's say, bring Osiris back to life, and also conceive his son Horus. Horus sits on his throne, so Horus takes over control of Egypt on behalf of his father Osiris, and Osiris rules the realm of the dead, quote unquote, or what's often called the netherworld. So Osiris, even after resurrection, is usually still depicted in most of his depictions as wrapped in mummification bandages. And so for each individual ancient Egyptian person, they have this Osirian form. So their quote unquote mummy, their mummified human remains, is mimicking this power of rejuvenation, right? That they called Osiris. That's really what Osiris is. He was a personification, a god who personified the power of living after death in a spiritualized form. So for the Egyptians, when they show you, for example, what you're looking at here, try to use our little pointer. So you have this papyrus. Here's the tomb chapel that's up on top on the ground. You go down the chamber. Here is your mummified remains, right? Your mummy down in the tomb. And it's your ba spirit or your soul that can travel back and forth between the two. So it's this form, this element. This is your Osirian element. This is your personal Osiris. What did Osiris do in the mythology? He was brought back to life, quote unquote, right? He's brought back to spiritual being. And so this stays here in order for when your ba spirit comes down each night, when the sun goes down, it reunites with your body. That gives it the power to rejuvenate. Remember, Osiris is the power of rejuvenation, to rejuvenate in the morning when the sun comes up the next day, so that you can leave your tomb and go out. And actually, in the Egyptian mythology, you join the gods and you ride around during the day with the sun god and his retinue in the solar bark. So you cross the sky with the sun. Your Osirian form stays in your tomb, right? Your little personal netherworld. And it's mimicking what we call the solar Osirian cycle. That is, when the sun rises and is born in the morning, it travels across the sky at night, during the day. And then when it goes down at night, it actually joins with Osiris in the underworld, so that it can get that power of rejuvenation from Osiris, who's the personification of that power, so that it can be reborn into the horizon the next morning. And essentially, you are mimicking that cycle through your own Osirian and solar elements. right? Your Ba spirit is a solar element, travels around during the day with the sun, and your body is your Osirian element that stays in your tomb at night. And what you see here is a depiction of this, what's called the solar Osirian unity. So at night, when the sun god joins with Osiris, this power of rejuvenation, this is a depiction of that. And notice what the hieroglyphs say around it. It is Re, the sun god, who rests in Osiris, and Osiris who rests in Re. Right? So this is that unity that gives the sun the ability to be reborn in the morning, the next morning. And of course, you want that ability yourself. So parts of you partake in that, right? Your spirit and your Osirian form. But what this means is that the Egyptians did not believe directly that this form that we're looking at here, right, jumps up off the mummy bed and walks around, right? It stays in this mummified form inside the wrappings, inside your tomb. This is the form that you take, right? Your spiritual form in the next world. The same way other religions think of their spiritual forms, right? Christianity and others think of a spiritual form, not necessarily the physical body out of the ground. This is similar, although not directly parallel to the ancient Egyptian beliefs. So the main takeaway from this is that the ancient Egyptians did not believe in the mummy as a monster to get up and sort of do you harm. This was an element of each individual that served for their spiritual rejuvenation or their spiritual resurrection by serving as a personification of that power of rejuvenation, right? Their Osirian form. So a lot of the character that we know as the mummy from the films, from the stories, etc., are influenced from a different angle, right? They're not taking that from ancient Egypt because ancient Egypt doesn't depict that. They don't show us that. They're not talking about that. And that's where we have to look at the early context of how Egypt was encountered, especially in the 19th century. And so all of this is sort of filtered through this larger lens that we might call Egyptomania, or in this particular case, mummy mania, since that's what we're talking about, the origin of this character today. So when we look at the sort of rediscovery of Egypt by the West, we can look at a few major punctuated events. Number one, the 1798 invasion of Egypt by Napoleon, which really transformed the access of Europe and even the Americas to Egypt exponentially, especially the publication that came out of this expedition, the description of Egypt that was published by the Napoleonic court, the geographers and scientists that he took to Egypt with him. That publication spread all over the world and took these influences with it. The 1822 decipherment of hieroglyphs by Champollion, the 1922 discovery of King Tutankhamun, and then the rise of global tourism to Egypt in 1970. These are all influencing different, you could call it phases or just different punctuated periods where Egypt becomes really popular in the public's consciousness, right? And so today, a lot of people, it's fairly accessible. You can just go and visit Egypt. But prior to this, you had these different events which influenced that. So for the Americas, we don't start getting collections of Egyptian antiquities, which include mummified remains, until the early 19th century. So in 1823, we have a sarcophagus that gets brought to Boston. In 1826, we have several sets of mummified human remains that actually end up in the possession of P.T. Barnum, right? So they end up, in sort of these carnival contexts or sort of circus context. We have a collection in 1832 that's donated to Johns Hopkins, and then a very famous episode in the 1830s and 1835. We have a man named Michael Chandler who's touring around the U.S. with a group of mummified human remains, and along with some of the funerary items with them, such as papyri. And as he's sort of traveling around the East Coast in through the Midwest, he's selling bits and pieces of these as he goes, trying to make money off of them. And some of them get bought up by the Mormon community of Kirkland, Ohio. There's a whole separate story that we could talk about there, maybe for another day. And here are some of the drawings from some of these human remains. Thank you. That include drawings of some of these individuals that were purchased by Michael Chandler and taken around. One ended up in the Niagara Falls Museum. And at this time, again, in the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, people traveling to Egypt, if you had the means, would often purchase human remains as a souvenir. You would bring a quote unquote mummy back with you. And so people were doing this in mass. It was very sort of popular. It's almost part of the grand tour, right? Go to Egypt, you have to get your mummy while you're there. And so you see stories like this. I'll just share a quick one that I was involved in a little bit, but you see this all over the United States. This is a set of mummified human remains that is today in the Maybe Guerrer Museum in Oklahoma. When it was discovered and purchased and brought to the United States, this is very common. Anyone who was mummified that they collected, quote unquote, they were always a princess or they were a pharaoh, right? They're never just a regular person, right? Or because they couldn't read the hieroglyphs at most of these times. So, or maybe they didn't have hieroglyphs or they didn't have them read yet. And so a lot of these were early advertised as some member of a royal family. This particular one, it has this long history of being traded back and forth until it ends up in the Maybe Guerrer Museum where it is today. But I was out there a few years ago when they were doing, they did a CT scan and they were doing a facial reconstruction of the individual inside. And of course, there's this history of referring to it as Princess so-and-so, and the CT scan suggested a female mummified person inside here. However, when you read the names on the coffin, it's inscribed for a man. And so this led to some awkward moments when we did this little event at the museum where they did the reveal of this facial reconstruction. And I had to say, well, unfortunately, the name on the cover, it belongs to a male figure, not a female. The point for this particular lecture is that this is how these types of quote unquote artifacts were being treated. Probably what happened here is that somewhere along the way, the inscribed chest piece was probably put on a different set of remains, right? Being sort of swapped around as these things are moving between different antiquities dealers' collections. And so a lot of these, you have a big mix match of actual individual artifacts that weren't all from the same set, right? So you'll have, for example, let's say a female quote unquote mummy that will end up in a male coffin and back and forth. So the point here is that these were being collected, treated, traded, and purchased as objects, right? People were thinking of these as adding them to their collection, and they were being depicted as such. This is a book by Binion in 1877 where he takes a lot of, for example, original artwork that appeared in that description of Egypt, the Napoleonic version. So here's a couple of examples. And then he republishes some of that stuff in his own book, including some of the depictions of mummified human remains, again, which appear when you look at the books. Notice what the book is called, Antiquities, right? And so these appear within that, along with lots of other stuff that you might expect to be called antiquities from ancient Egypt. And again, the main point that I want to make here, I'm not trying to show you these pictures just to for any kind of shock value, but this is how the individuals at the time were approaching this type of material. Thomas Pettigrew, sometimes called Mummy Pettigrew, was very famous in the UK and Britain for unrolling mummies. And this became a social pastime during this time. You could actually advertise it in the newspaper. Hey, everybody, come to my mummy unwrapping that I'm going to have, and we're going to unwrap this mummy. And again, this is where maybe the part of the talk that is maybe the most upsetting to us today. You get into situations like this where people are all together unwrapping these ancient mummified individuals. There's very famous scenes and paintings of this happening with the royal mummies when they were discovered in the 1880s and 1890s. That's what you see in these two illustrations, which appeared in the press at the time, showing the unwrappings happening by the French authorities in Egypt while this was happening. And it continued right up until the early 20th century, even here still in Chicago, where people were still unwrapping mummies for quote unquote scientific value all the way into the early 20th century. So that you even end up with mummified human remains that are completely unwrapped or partially unwrapped even today. And so this objectification of these individuals, right, these ancient people, had this corollary effect where, for example, ground human remains were referred to as mumia and were sold as an elixir, right? A mumia comes from the word that just might mean bitumen or pitch. I'll show you a picture of what that means in a minute. But this was powdered remains, not always human, I should say. Some of the mummified remains could be from animals as well, because in ancient Egypt, they also mummified animals. This was often treated as a medicinal cure-all, even an aphrodisiac, and an ingredient in what was called mummy brown, which is a type of paint. This is what we're referring to, bitumen or pitch. This is the black sacred liquids that was poured over during the embalming process. So you can see here on a coffin or on the left side, actually on the wrappings directly. This was, for the ancient Egyptians, a sacralizing practice. They poured this over to make the body sacred. And when these remains were dug up, not only were they used for things like fuel, but they could also be made into other ingredients, again, into things like this. You can see in the center, mummy brown paint, which here's, this is from an article on a website where they were documenting this. They say, in a more horrifically modern twist, the last tube of mummy brown paint was manufactured relatively recently. The color making firm Robertson and Company included mummy brown paint in their artist catalog until 1933, but the last tube was made in 1964. The firm stated, we might have a few odd limbs lying around somewhere, but not enough to make any more paint. We sold our last complete mummy some years ago, I think, for £3. Perhaps we shouldn't have. We certainly can't get any more. So even still in the 1960s, or even up until the 1980s, quote unquote, mummy parts may have been around the shop where they were making this particular color of paint. So again, the digression into this element is necessary because for us to get to the point where we're looking at, for what the ancient Egyptians were, a sacred object and was their ancestors, right? Their mummified ancestors, to be a monster in like a film or a story, there's this process of objectification, right? In between that ancient concept and this modern concept. And I actually brought a few books, if you guys want to look at them before you leave, that cover some of this. And I brought this particular one from my colleague, Christina Riggs, where she describes in this book how the process of wrapping in ancient Egypt, of secreting, right? You're covering something up so you can't see it. You're putting it in a tomb so you can't see it, so you can't access it. That was part of the sacralizing process, right? To make these things sacred, to make them special. And what she points out is that for us and for modern scientific techniques, we do the exact opposite, right? We have to take them out, unwrap them, shine a bright light on them, look at them very closely. So for, in her words, what was wrapped was secret, it was set apart. What was unwrapped could be handled, documented, seen, and known. And so what she's pointing out is that the implication is that the motivations of ancient Egyptian practice and the modern scientific disciplines are at odds with each other, right? So our discipline of examination, looking, taking apart, analysis, it's the exact opposite of what the ancient Egyptians were doing when they were mummifying, wrapping, and secreting away these individuals that, of course, were their family members and ancestors. So it was part of that that objectification process that allowed in the early 19th century for these stories to develop where you have figures based on ancient Egyptian mummification practices, but completely separated from that meaning, right? Because it's been completely objectified. That's why, think about this for a second. When you're treating these things as antiquities, it's one way that you can get to a nameless monster called the mummy, and even a faceless monster called the mummy, right? Because to these people in creating these stories, they weren't necessarily ancient Egyptian individuals, right? They were mummies. They were things. And a colleague of mine has written a book about this, Angela Stein, Mummified. I brought this book as well, that talks about some of the stories behind these mummified human remains that we find in museums all over the world today. So to sort of summarize from that section, again, we have on the one hand influence from actual ancient Egyptian tales, like that tale of Setna that we saw before. We have the Scroll of Thoth, we have the Mummy's Curse. But then a really important factor here is that objectification of mummies as an antiquity, as a thing that you can collect, that you can ground up, that you can use in other ways. that allows for this belief of the mummy as a monster, as a horrific figure to spring up alongside the Victorian Gothic. And so that's the other part of this story to get to where you are, let's say in 1932 when they're making the mummy film, or even today when you're seeing mummy films, mummy toys, right? Mummy candy, like mummy everything that you can find. And I've seen everything. My former professor was an avid collector, and he had every kind of thing mummy that you can imagine, anything from like rolls of bubble tape to erasers to figures sitting on his desk. This is really everywhere. But what we see when we look back at the beginning of these mummy stories is a whole series of a development from where you see the first reanimated figures, often referred to as from ancient Egypt, and how that develops into the story that you sort of might know today. And so that begins in the second quarter of the 19th century, and one of the first real modern quote unquote mummy stories is by Jane Webb in 1827, and there's a whole series of them after. We'll look at these sort of one by one for some of these, but there's a whole series of these, some of them written by famous individuals. So notice in 1845, Edgar Allan Poe even writes his own mummy story. That's a really interesting one because Poe takes the opportunity to sort of lambast modern Western culture. So when they reanimate this ancient Egyptian, basically it comes back and says like, how silly and foolish you people are. So he actually uses it to turn around and look at our own culture. And also Arthur Conan Doyle brings in not just mummy stories, but things like The Ring of Thoth, echoing that book of Thoth that we saw earlier. So the first one of these is this 1827 book, The Mummy, by Jane Webb. And this one is interesting because number one, it's got the title, The Mummy, right? So we have this as sort of the birth of that part of the mummy franchise you might think of. But the thing with The Mummy in Webb's novel is that it's not the mummy of the later stories. This is very much wedded with Frankenstein. And in this particular story, the reanimation happens through electricity. So just like in the Frankenstein, this is where again, we're wedding these themes from the Victorian Gothic with what we know about the sort of objectification of ancient Egypt to give you these early mummy stories. So here, this is just a little excerpt. I wish to try to resuscitate a mummy. The scheme is wild, vague, and impractical. Not if doctor's hypothesis be true for supposing the souls of ancient Egyptians to be chained to their bodies and to be remaining in them in a torpid state. It is very possible that by employing so powerful an agent as galvanism, reanimation may be produced. So in this particular case, again, they're reanimating the body with electricity. Again, you can compare that with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the stories that have come out of that. A lot of the other stories from this time period are building upon that, although some of them are slightly different. So again, as I mentioned, Edgar Allan Poe's version, Some Words with a Mummy, was an attempt for him to sort of poke fun at our own culture. And so this is one of the speeches that you see here. Come to me by all means, my dear good friend, as soon as you can receive me, come and help us rejoice at last. By long preserving diplomacy, I have gained the assent of the directors of the City Museum to my examination of the mummy. You know the one I mean. I have permission to unswath it and open it if desirable, right? Going back to those mummy unwrapping parties we were just talking about, right? I have permission, like the whole scene of the story is set up as a mummy unwrapping, a mummy reanimation. It's recalling all of those same tropes that are happening at the same time. I mean, in the 1830s is when you had that guy, the surgeon, quote unquote, Thomas Mummy Pettigrew, who's unwrapping mummies in the UK. So this is all happening at the same time. This is in the cultural consciousness. We also have, and then again here, again, somewhere the application of electricity to a mummy, etc. Right? We have this same trope that we saw in the Webb novel, bringing back, reanimating the body through electricity. Then we have Gautier's writings. This is a little bit later. This was originally published in French, The Mummy's Foot, in 1840, and then it was translated for the first time into English in 1871. And it's the plot of the story is somebody sort of in an antique store, quote unquote antique store, and they see a mummy's foot, and they look at purchasing it, right? This foot will answer my purpose. I was startled by its lightness. It was not a foot of bronze, but a foot of flesh, a foot embalmed, a foot of a mummy. Ha ha, you wish to purchase the foot of the princess Hermonthis. Again, it's not just any foot, it's a princess. You see all these different sort of tropes coming together. And of course, this is very common in collections all over the world. Here from a recent online, I think this was on an auction. Notice it's Ripley's Rarities, mummy foot, mummified from, this time period. And you just have this portion of this individual. And this is very common in collections all around the world where you have these pieces. Because again, if you think about these individuals who were traveling to Egypt in the 19th century who wanted to bring home a souvenir like this, maybe they couldn't afford a nicer mummy in a coffin or something like that, they would bring home these pieces as souvenirs, and then they often would get gifted to museum collections or study collections later on. So you had a whole series of these tales based on this sort of similar set of tropes. Reanimation of a body, at first using electricity, but then morphing into a more esoteric form where they're using, let's say, magic spells from a papyrus that they may have found, or from texts that are found along, let's say, on the coffin with the human remains in the stories. And these stories grow all throughout the 19th century. The Ring of Thoth by Arthur Conan Doyle. You have a whole series in the 40s, 50s, and 60s of these pulp comics that make use of images and these elements in their text, things like Brood of the Witch Queen. Again, I don't necessarily read all of these to you, Lords of the Ghostlands, but you can look some of these up online, in these weird tales and famous fantastic mysteries, where again, they're adopting all of these tropes and ancient Egyptian imagery, basically to play on this public fascination and orientalizing of these ideas and these themes. And there's lots and lots of these. I won't bore you with reading through all of these, but lots of this ancient Egyptian imagery mixed with the Victorian Gothic, mixed with this objectification to produce the stories that we know, going all the way back to where we started with this pulp comic, again, where we have the mummy up and walking around and the protagonist trying to stop its monstrosity by reading spells out of a magic book. So where does that leave us in terms of looking at the origins of this pop culture icon, this mummy as a character? Well, again, just to sort of summarize what we've been looking at, the mummy is maybe not the character you think, in that most of the creation of that character has almost nothing actually to do with ancient Egypt, right? It's sort of an appropriation superficially of a couple of elements and then combined with all of this other material that's growing out of the 19th and 20th century West, Europe and the Americas in particular. And so that character is mostly an invention of that context, with a very superficial borrowing of just, let's say, ancient themes, but without any real serious engagement with them. And it was this objectification in the 19th and 20th centuries of the actual ancient mummified human remains, sort of treating them as nameless and faceless, quote unquote, mummies, that helped pave the way for the mummy, the character, to become a nameless and often faceless monster. And then, as I said before, the ancient Egyptians did not believe in the physical reanimation of the body. They didn't believe that their ancestral family members got up and walked around the tomb. Rather, the body was an Osirian vessel, symbolic of the spiritual regeneration, and then imbued with mythological allusions when you read about it in the text. So this character is born out of this long, let's say, century and a half set of traditions, and only very loosely calling back to some superficially borrowed, or you might say appropriated simple themes from ancient Egypt, like rapping, like quote unquote a tomb curse, or reciting magic spells, but they had no real deep engagement with the actual ancient Egyptian material. So most of what you know as the mummy, the character, is completely an invention of the West in the 19th and 20th centuries, building up through, in fact, those early stories that we saw, starting with Jane Webb and on, being some of the most important sources that end up as these movies and media that we know today. So thank you very much.